Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. In our third and final part of modern federalism, we will be examining federalism in practice. Let's start off with this question. Professor Peterson, how large of a role do state and local governments play in the American government system?
Well, Chris, it's a pretty large role. If you look at this graph, you can see that the federal role has increased pretty substantially over the years. But the state role, which is the blue line, has also increased steadily. So if you put military spending to one side and foreign policy spending to one side and look at the domestic expenditures of the government, the amount being spent by state and local governments is just about as much as by the federal government. The federal government pays for Social Security and Medicare, but so much else of what government does in the United States is being done by state and local governments. And a lot of the money that is being spent by state and local governments comes from the federal government, but then state and local government employees do the work. So if you look in this graph, you can see that there's been a very large increase in the number of local employees. That's the red line that goes way up on the graph. And there's been an increase in state employees as well since the 1940s, steadily rising. Whereas, amazingly enough, the federal government, the number of employees working for the federal government has actually stayed about the same for civilian purposes. The military force has declined since the days of the Vietnam War and the Korean War. So we no longer have as large a military as we used to have, but even more interesting is the fact that we do not have a growing federal government. We have a growing state and local government.
In the United States today, we say we have a system of competitive federalism. What do we mean when we say that?
Well, Chris, competitive federalism is not a word that everybody uses, but I think it's a really interesting concept, and it isolates the kind of federalism that we have in the United States, this exceptional form of federalism that exists only in Canada and Switzerland outside the United States. Competitive federalism places state and local governments in competition with one another. They're each trying to get the businesses to come to their state, and they're each trying to get prosperous individuals to come and settle in their state or their locality. And to compete effectively with the other state and local governments, each local government, each state government must provide quality services at reasonable prices to the citizens. And that means that at the state and local level, you don't have much in the way of redistribution unless the federal government pays for it. So state and local governments do administer the Medicaid program, and they do administer some other social welfare programs, but mainly these programs are paid for by the federal government. The state governments will pay for police, fire protection, schools, and other things that are services that everybody in the local community want. But if they start providing for a range of services for low-income people and begin to tax high-income people too much, there will be a migration away from that part of the country to other parts of the country. And we see that today in the United States as people are moving away from the high-tax states in the Northeast and on the West Coast into the interior of the United States and to the southern states, which have much lower taxes.
Has this system of competitive federalism changed at all in the contemporary era?
Well, I think it has, Chris. Although the changes are slow, we still have the basic competitive federalism that influences what states are doing. But there have been two trends that have moved state and local governments in a more liberal direction than it has historically been. Historically, business interests were very powerful at the state and local government. Now today you've brought in the policy professionals who administer the social services, and they've acquired a degree of power. And you have the public sector unionism, the fact that The people who work for the government have organized themselves into unions and have won collective bargaining rights, and they're able to get considerable benefits for themselves, and they're able to influence state and local politics. And this is a new area of political contention, largely over the pension policies that have been established for the benefit of public sector employees.
What is one important consequence of this shift in our federal system?
Well, Chris, one secret to competitive federalism is that any state or locality can go bankrupt. And that is what makes a federal system a competitive system. So it is the case in Switzerland and in Canada and in the United States that the lowest tier of government in principle could go bankrupt. And in the United States, we did have bankruptcies in the middle of the 19th century, and we had bankruptcies during the 1930s. And recently, we've had a bankruptcy in Detroit, Michigan. So we have the possibility of a government actually going bankrupt, and not just the national government, but a local government. Now, that's the very definition of sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to go bankrupt. If you can't go bankrupt, you're not sovereign. Because if somebody is always going to pay your bills, then they're going to start telling you what to do. So today we have a situation where the threat of bankruptcy is keeping in check state and local governments, but there are other pressures on these state and local governments to spend money coming from the policy professionals and the liberal influences that are shaping local policies to a greater extent than they used to be. And so the risk of bankruptcy seems to be rising, especially in places like Michigan, Illinois, and California.
You already alluded to this, but how can the risk of bankruptcy be a balancing force within the federal system?
Well, that's the interesting thing, Chris, because most people think bankruptcy is horrible, and it is horrible if you have to go through it. But the risk of bankruptcy is something that keeps a governmental system in check. It allows for the American federal system to be a dynamic system where you can have very effective local government in which local people can feel that they have an engagement with their political leaders at the local level. And the risk of bankruptcy keeps those governments from pursuing policies that are irresponsible. It keeps them in check. And it's an amazing thing that the United States has had this exceptional system of federalism that has evolved over a long period of time. But it's always a possibility that in the future that could change. Now, in the European case, we have something like competitive federalism at the international level, because the European community has all these countries that are part of it. And in a sense, they are like our states. Greece, Italy, and Spain are a little bit like Illinois, Michigan, and California. They are places that have autonomy within a larger federation, and they have the capacity to go bankrupt, but they ask for help from the higher levels of government.
Is bankruptcy risk rising for state and local governments?
Are you asking the question, Chris, are we becoming more like Greece and Italy and other places in Europe? And yes, indeed, if you look at this chart, you can see that the amount of outstanding debt has increased. And this does not include the pension debt that's been rising as well. So a lot of people think that Detroit is not the only city that's at risk of bankruptcy.
That raises this interesting question. Should the federal government step in and rescue state and local governments?
Some people think so, Chris. Christopher Edley, who's the former dean of the Berkeley Law School, has argued that the best booster shot for an economy that's in trouble, as we were in the United States during the recent recession, is to allow states to borrow from the Treasury during a period like that. Well, if states can start borrowing from the federal government in order to avoid going bankrupt, then we're going to change the nature of our federal system.
Professor Peterson, in conclusion, how relevant is dual sovereign theory to American federalism today, and what are the takeaways?
Well, actually, Chris, dual sovereign theory sounds like it died in the 19th century with the Civil War, but somehow it has survived in different ways. The Supreme Court has never extended the power of the federal government to such an extent that state and local governments don't still have a sphere of sovereignty, a degree of autonomy. And the fact that states can levy their own taxes and are spending so much money and providing so many services for so many people gives them a place in the American governmental system that is not always appreciated. It's not the case that all the decisions are being made in Washington. There's a lot of decisions being made at the local level. And dual sovereignty is very much a part of the American system, even to the point where state and local governments have the risk of going bankrupt.
That's the end of modern federalism, and in the next lecture, we'll move on to take a look at the modern courts.